It was one of those moments so absurd, so outrageously petty, it left me teetering between laughter and disbelief. I tightened the final bolt on a towering 6-foot wooden fence, a barrier that now split our once idyllic lakefront clean in half, through the grass, over the dock, and right into the water like it had been sliced by some bureaucratic scalpel. Behind me, a small crowd of stunned neighbors stood in silence, watching the structure rise with a mix of awe and horror. On the other side of the fence, Margaret, cousin to the infamous HOA president Karen, stood slack-jawed, her luxurious lounge chairs and half-finished jet ski ramp now cut off by a wall of fresh lumber. It all began 5 years ago, when I bought what I thought was my forever home in Willowbrook Estates, lured by the promise of deeded lakefront access. The property included shared use of a sandy beach and a communal dock, both of which quickly became the heartbeat of our summer weekends. My kids and I spent countless evenings fishing, swimming, and soaking in the simple joy of that lake. It wasn't just scenery, it was part of our life. Then, everything changed. 6 months ago, Karen Fitzgerald became HOA president. And almost overnight, she transformed into the iron-fisted ruler of our neighborhood utopia. She began issuing fines over grass height, banned wind chimes claiming noise pollution, and demanded written permission to plant anything not on her personal approved list. But her real power grab came through cronyism. Her brother-in-law was appointed the official landscape inspector, on the HOA payroll, of course, and her childhood best friend suddenly held the pool maintenance contract. When her cousin Margaret arrived for an extended stay, all pretense of fair governance evaporated. I knew things had taken a turn when Margaret began installing what looked like a private resort on the shared lakefront. We weren't talking about a beach chair and umbrella, this was a full-blown takeover, massive loungers, tiki torches, pounding music, and even a construction crew laying the groundwork for a jet ski ramp. The whole setup blocked the view and cut off access to the dock for the rest of us. I approached her respectfully, introduced myself, and reminded her the lakefront was shared property. She looked at me like I was trespassing on royal grounds and waved a paper in my face, a so-called easement reassignment supposedly granting her exclusive use of that part of the shoreline. According to her, Karen had given it to her since I only used it on weekends. Something didn't sit right. I took a closer look at the document. It claimed the HOA had unanimously voted to reassign access rights to Margaret for the duration of her stay. A bold statement, especially since 2 board members were out of state during that so-called vote. My instincts kicked in. I reached out to the city planning office and county property records. Sure enough, both confirmed the lakefront was. It turned out the deed to the lakefront wasn't vague or open to interpretation, it was crystal clear. Ownership was tied directly to specific properties, mine included, and no HOA vote, backroom deal, or bogus amendment could override that without a formal, legal process. Karen's so-called reassignment wasn't just invalid, it was laughable in the eyes of the law. Armed with these facts, I presented everything at the next HOA meeting, expecting a debate. What I got instead was theater worthy of a daytime soap. Karen's face turned beet red, her knuckles white as she gripped the podium like it was the last lifeboat on the Titanic. With wild-eyed fury, she announced that the HOA had recently amended its bylaws, allegedly giving the board full control over all waterfront decisions. As if that weren't enough, she then declared that anyone who challenged these new rules would be fined $500 a day. She even held up another so-called amendment, conveniently undocumented, of course, claiming it had passed during a special meeting no one in the room could recall. While she spun her fantasy of absolute authority, Margaret continued transforming the lakefront into her personal resort. From sunrise to sundown, music blared. Her guests left bottles, cans, and food wrappers scattered across the sand. The jet ski ramp now stood fully completed, a hulking wooden insult to the entire neighborhood. But it was what happened next that flipped the switch in me for good. One quiet morning, my 8-year-old daughter, towel in hand, walked down to the water for her usual swim. Before she could step onto the sand, Margaret physically blocked her path and snapped that the space was private property now. My daughter turned and walked back in silence, tears streaming down her cheeks. That moment, that was it. The line had been crossed. For the next week, I was a man possessed. As a contracts attorney, this was my battleground. I dusted off every relevant document, my home purchase agreement, the original property survey, the HOA charter, and even decades of meeting minutes stored in online archives. What I found left no room for doubt. The lakefront was deeded directly to my lot, and the HOA's own governing rules made it explicitly clear, they had zero jurisdiction over deeded land. Any attempt to interfere not only broke their own charter, but also opened the door to personal liability. I drafted a formal notice, concise, forceful, and legally bulletproof, and sent certified copies to both Karen and Margaret. They had 72 hours to remove all unauthorized structures and items from the shared lakefront, or face immediate legal action. Predictably, they didn't take it seriously. By the next morning, Karen appeared at my front door with Margaret in tow and a man she grandly introduced as their legal counsel. The guy looked like he'd prepped for this meeting by watching courtroom dramas on cable. What followed was a circus. They threw out threats, bribes, and downright ridiculous legal theories. Karen offered to waive my HOA dues for a full year if I'd just let things slide. Margaret, in her best peacemaking voice, suggested a rotating schedule. She'd use the lakefront Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. The so-called lawyer muttered something about squatters' rights, which earned him a raised eyebrow and a calm but firm suggestion to leave my porch. The 72-hour deadline passed without a single piece of furniture moved. In fact, Margaret escalated things, beginning construction on a shade pavilion, an insult carved from wood and entitlement. That's when I initiated Phase 2. I hired a licensed surveyor to mark the precise property boundaries. As I suspected, the lakefront was split evenly down the middle. And Margaret? She had colonized both halves without apology. Armed with the surveyor's flags and a renewed sense of resolve, I headed to the local hardware store and ordered enough fencing to send a clear, unmistakable message. The clerk raised his eyebrows when I explained what it was for. Making a statement, he asked. No, I said with a smile. Just marking property lines. Word spread like wildfire. By the time I returned home, the neighborhood was buzzing. Phones rang, curtains twitched, and texts flew. The next morning, just as the sun cracked over the lake, I stood at the water's edge with a full crew, ready to reclaim what was mine, one wooden panel at a time. We had the permits, the survey, and a mission. By mid-morning, the fence stood tall and unwavering, an unbroken line stretching from one end of the beach to the other. It even cut directly through the center of the community dock, splitting it like a clean surgical incision. It was practical, sure, but there was something undeniably poetic about it too. Just as the final panels locked into place, Margaret stormed out onto the deck, her bathrobe flapping behind her like a cape of denial. The mug in her hand slipped, shattering on the planks the moment she saw her loungers blocked off. Karen arrived shortly after, decked out in foam curlers and righteous indignation, trailing behind a growing audience of curious neighbors. The meltdown was instant and magnificent. Karen shrieked everything from vandalism to trespassing to emotional distress, even throwing in a wild claim of identity theft for good measure. She called the police. They reviewed my permits, glanced at the survey, nodded, and left. She contacted city code enforcement, who found no violations. Then, in what I can only assume was desperation, she began climbing the ladder of authority, from city hall to the county, perhaps even dialing numbers that ended in .gov in the faint hope someone, anyone, would stop the fence. But nothing stuck. Meanwhile, Margaret's private resort turned into a slapstick set piece. Half the jet ski ramp jutted uselessly from behind the fence. Her sound system was split down the middle, one speaker booming on each side like dueling stereos. The shade structure? Useless. Its posts straddled both sides like confused stage props abandoned in the middle of a failed performance. That evening, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting, desperate to regain control. Flyers had been shoved into every mailbox labeling me the neighborhood menace. But the attempt backfired spectacularly. The community didn't show up to support her, they came armed with receipts. First to speak was Tom Harrison, a retired judge, who coolly outlined every legal overstep the board had made under Karen's rule. Then came Sarah Chen, whose flower garden had once been bulldozed for one of Karen's improvement projects. She brought documentation. Others followed. One after another, neighbors stepped forward, each one chipping away at the edifice of corruption Karen had built. Then, in a twist no one expected, Margaret's husband entered the room. He surveyed the chaos, his wife, the fence, the legal mess, and made a snap decision. They were leaving. As he quietly supervised the dismantling of Margaret's backyard setup, several neighbors overheard him muttering about how Karen had dragged them into an expensive disaster. Karen, not one to go down quietly, made one last play. She announced an executive order to have the fence removed immediately. But the board's own attorney, who had been silent through much of the drama, finally spoke up. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. Karen had, in his words, grossly overstepped her authority, exposed the HOA to legal liability, and must be removed. The vote wasn't even close. It was unanimous. Karen was out. But that was only the beginning of the reckoning. A full audit of HOA finances followed. What they uncovered was damning. Karen had funneled community funds into creating Margaret's fake easement documents and had been siphoning money from the landscaping budget into her brother-in-law's inflated paychecks. The board pressed charges. 3 months later, Karen stood in a courtroom, facing charges of fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. The verdict was swift: guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered to repay $47,000 to the HOA. As the judge's gavel came down, Karen crumpled, tears, gasps, the whole scene. And me? I still sit by the lake some mornings, coffee in hand, admiring the fence that now stands like a quiet sentinel. The water is still again. The dock is shared, as it was always meant to be. The drama is over, but the peace that followed? That's the real victory. Ask ChatGPT.